Namaste and welcome. Today we have with us, this Sunday afternoon in our program, Yoga for Unity and Well-being, 100 Days Towards the International Day of Yoga 2021, a lecture from Dr.Kausthub Desikachar. He is the son of the great TKV Desikachar, son of Krishnamacharya ji, one of the father figures of yoga in India, especially in modern India. Dr. Kausthub Desikachar was born in the world of yoga. Since a very young age, he learnt about it from his grandfather and his father. And today he explains to us the Viniyoga style, or the tradition called Viniyoga. What is it about? What was it like to be part of a lineage of such great masters of yoga? And how does yoga fit into the modern context? He explains so many things in his lecture that we do hope you look at this, if not for yoga, but at least to understand how traditions of yoga are formed. What is the importance of Guru-Shishya Parampara, the master-disciple relationship, and how modern yoga is breaking barriers and going beyond horizons. Today, a whole new revolution has come from such great teachers as Krishnamacharya ji and Desikachar ji. How does Dr. Kausthub Desikachar, in his turn, take this tradition forward from Chennai in India, where he lives? Let's listen to him. Namaste.
Namaste, my dear friends. My name is Kausthub Desikachar. I am representing the Viniyoga tradition today. It's a wonderful honor to be part of this International Day of Yoga festivities, and I'm so grateful to share my thoughts and views to all of you. I would like to introduce the topic by actually tracing the origins of the Viniyoga tradition. Now, Viniyoga tradition, our tradition is probably one of the oldest continuous tradition now in the world of yoga today. We can trace back to our ancestor called Sri Muni, who was a great yogi and a saint living in the 800s, which means I think the 9th century. And we can trace a continuous lineage back to him, and he is the Acharya who restarted all of this. But if we go back even further, there is some non-contiguity because the history was not recorded so well in those days. We go back to a great Acharya called Nammalvar, who we consider as our first ancestor, who is supposed to have lived in South India about 3,000 to 3,500 years ago, in a very holy place that is called Alvar Tirunagari. It's actually named after him. At that time, probably it was not called that, it was called something else. But it is named after him because he is called Nammalvar. The place was called Alvar Tirunagari later by people who visited there. So we trace back to this lineage where the Viniyoga lineage is also very strongly connected to the teachings of Patanjali. So in a certain way, when you look at many yoga traditions, there are generally two branches of yoga tradition that are there. One is tantric schools that are basically coming from the Shaiva Tantra of North India, which is the Hatha Yoga schools or the Natha tradition. Whereas our tradition is a Vedic tradition because it traces its origins back to Patanjali, the Yoga Darshana, as well as the Vedas themselves. So this is basically the long history of the Viniyoga tradition. And since Muni in the 9th century, there has been a contiguous lineage of teachers who have been transmitting this tradition through both good times as well as dark times, so that we are having the luxury and privilege of enjoying this tradition today. In recent history, what we would call the modern history, our lineage goes back to Sri T Krishnamacharya, who is actually my grandfather, who is considered by many as the grandfather of modern yoga, if not at least one of the most important teachers of modern yoga. And again, he was succeeded by Sri TKV Desikachar, my father, and currently I try to take care of this auspicious lineage that has been handed down for many, many generations. Now, what is very unique about the Viniyoga tradition is that first and foremost, we represent the classical teaching of yoga. Our teaching is not based on modern understanding of the human body like Western medicine, etc., but rather our tradition is based on the classical way that yoga and Ayurveda understood the human body. This is very, very important. So we always go back to textual references such as the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, such as the Yoga Rahasya of Nathamuni, such as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika of Swatmarama, the Yoga Yajnavalkya, Samhita of Yajnavalkya, etc. So we teach yoga from a classical place, from origins that are rooted in the classical texts of yoga. Because we strongly believe that that is how yoga must be understood. Because yoga has a rich tradition and we must embrace this rich tradition rather than try to find meaning through the interpretation of some other systems which may or may not actually hold value. This is very important, and this is one of the first and the most unique features of our tradition. The second thing is that we focus essentially on one-to-one teaching, because we believe that the most important principle of yoga is individualization of practices, because we are not all made the same. If you look around even your own family members, you will see that everyone is different. The height is different, the weight is different, their physical capacity is different, mental capacity is different, emotional and psychological states are different, lifestyle choices are different, the outlook in which people look at life is different. So it's not possible that one practice or one method fits everybody. The same way, yoga as a practice is not really suitable to be done in a way where it is standardized and everybody has to try to fit into that standard. That will only create lots of problems because we are all not made the same way. If you look at it, we apply this principle in more or less every domain of our life. We don't buy the same clothes that everybody else buys. We don't eat the same food that everybody else eats. We don't live our life the same way everybody else lives. The same way, we must also individualize practice, which is a personal practice that is suitable for all. So all our personal practices that we teach our students are all taught one-to-one, and this is where we bring in very unique modifications and variations of every tool of yoga. For example, we bring in modifications in asana practice to suit the different bodies. We bring in variations in pranayama practice to suit different people's breathing capacities. We bring in variations in the way a person will apply the mudras or the bandhas dependent on what is their ability and capacity. We choose different focuses for meditation based on what is suitable for each person. So in every tool of yoga, we are individualizing, and therefore we teach it one-to-one. And that's why we strongly emphasize this concept of mentoring. We do not have a program in our school where mentoring does not have a place, because this one-to-one teaching is very, very essential. Even when we are doing some teacher training in group classes, we are always insisting that they take their private classes for their personal practices so that they receive what is suitable for them. The third feature of our tradition is that we are utilizing the whole range of yogic tools. Patanjali did not only present asana practices as part of yoga. Patanjali actually prescribes a number of tools as part of yoga. So we are introducing all of these tools to our students, and based on what is suitable, sometimes we combine these tools together so that they can get potent practices. So we teach not just asanas but also pranayama, we teach mantras, we teach bhavana, which are visualizations. We are teaching mudras and bandhas, which are specific energetic tools that are advanced pranayama. We are teaching meditation practices. We are teaching what is called nyasa, that are certain body placements using the hands. We are also giving dietary and lifestyle suggestions to our students in order for them to live life more holistically and also in a much more healthier manner. Another unique feature, the fourth one, is that we encourage all of our students, if they are open, to engage with mantras and Vedic chanting, because this is a very important part of yoga. If you really go back to the origins of yoga, Patanjali's yoga is always samantraka, that involves the use of mantras. So we very openly ask the people if they are willing to engage in these practices, and if they are open to it, dependent on their belief systems, we encourage them and we teach them in a systematic, classical way how the mantras are taught, how it should be taught, etc. And this is a very unique feature for this our tradition, because traditionally mantras were only allowed for male Brahmins. However, my grandfather Acharya T Krishnamacharya opened the doors of this practice to every sincere seeker, and today we are teaching our students not only who are Brahmins but who are from every class of society, and also international students as well, who are not even Hindu but they are open to receiving it. But most importantly, we are also teaching it to women, which is also quite revolutionary what Acharya T Krishnamacharya did when he opened the doors of mantras and Vedic chanting to women. And today we are so proud to say that most of our students, especially in the chanting classes, or most of them, or majority of them, are women. A vast majority of them are women, and we are very proud of this, because it's not just a confident and bold move, but it is something that is socially revolutionary. It's especially in that time in India, way back in the early part of the 1900s. The last and very important unique feature of our tradition is that since it is mostly focused on one-to-one teaching, our teaching is essentially very well suited to yoga therapy, and Acharya T Krishnamacharya was considered as a pioneer of yoga therapy who revived this concept. He didn't invent this, because yoga therapy has existed as long as yoga has existed. But he revived this in the early part of the 1900s, and you see that it's a wonderful way in which we are able to help a lot of people. And because our teaching is also focused on individualized classes, we are able to offer therapy in a very, very good manner, because we are well suited for yoga therapy. Because therapy has got to consider individualization, because what illnesses one person will have is very different from what illnesses somebody else may have. Even if there is more than one illness, it's even more interesting, because there is not many people who just come with one problem. We all have different problems. So the unique combination is very different. The stage of life is different. The capacities are different. The responsibilities we carry at each of us is different. For example, mother who has only one child may be having more time than a mother who has 4 children. So how we teach the same mother who may have similar problems will be different. So in a way, this is a very important and a very important, a big part of the work that we are doing. And when we say we are talking about yoga as a therapy, we are not just talking about physiological illnesses. Most of the people who come to us don't just come only for physiological problems, but they also come for their emotional and psychological problems as well as in some cases some spiritual problems as well. So there's a whole range of areas where yoga as a therapy is quite useful, and this is one of the big parts of our tradition as well. So these things would probably define what is actually the Viniyoga tradition. And one of the things that is very important is to see that modern yoga has moved quite far away from traditional yoga. When you look at modern yoga, I would like now to present some differences between modern yoga and our Viniyoga tradition, but not just our Viniyoga tradition, but any traditional school of yoga as well will differ quite differently from how modern yoga has come. Modern yoga is often looking yoga in a very physical perspective, mostly restricted themselves to asana practice. Whereas in traditional yoga, there is the approach of health and well-being in a holistic manner, and therefore the tools are not just restricted to asana, but also embraces all other tools of yoga that Patanjali has talked about. The modern yoga is usually taking a standardized approach and tries to conform the individual to practice, whereas traditional yoga offers intelligent and creative options of practices that are tailored to suit each and every individual differently. Modern yoga is now unfortunately looking yoga as a merely gymnastic form of exercise, ignoring yoga's philosophical roots. Yoga is actually a darshana. Yoga darshana, it's called. It's a philosophy. It's not just a practice. Whereas classical traditional schools of yoga, we talk about the philosophical aspects of yoga as the basis for the practices. We don't ignore the philosophy. We don't ignore the practice. We base the practice on the philosophy. We are not just looking at practice as a gymnastic form of exercise. Modern yoga is very strongly influenced by Western perspective that actually results in a very shallow and flawed understanding of yogic principles, because there's an inconsistent patchwork approach. We take bits and pieces of information from disconnected sources and try to create some theories. This is what is happening in modern yoga. And that's why it's not really working out very well, because there is no complete picture. Whereas traditional yoga actually offers a very great understanding of yoga, consistent with its philosophical roots and focusing on subtle principles like prana, the subtle anatomy of the human body, the doshas, etc. And therefore, there is a very, very sophisticated and subtle understanding and a very consistent approach. Because if you take asana, pranayama, dharana, dhyana, meditation, mantras, etc., there is an approach. There are asanas that influence vata, pitta, or kapha. There is pranayama that influence vata, pitta, or kapha. There are mantras that influence vata, pitta, or kapha, etc. So if you teach yoga from its philosophical roots, there is a consistency. Whereas if you teach yoga from a very bits and piece approach like we have in modern yoga, it's not going to be consistent. Most modern schools of yoga are usually focusing on yoga styles, which is basically a commercialization of a certain set of practices. And usually the styles are based on the asanas, the way the asanas are done. If you do an asana in one particular way, it's called Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. If you do asana in another way, it's called the Iyengar Yoga. If you do asana in a hot room, it's called hot yoga, etc. But that's not really the actual nature of yoga. In traditional yoga, there is actually approaches to yoga, like paths of yoga, like karma marga or bhakti marga, etc., rather than based on a certain commercial approach of marketing, like this block of this set of tools is this style, that set of tool is this style. So styles of yoga is actually something that is not consistent with the principles of yoga itself. Another thing that is quite important is that, as I said earlier, many modern schools of yoga are very fixed on standardized practices where they say, okay, beginners will do this set of practices, intermediates will do this set of practices, advanced will do this set of practices. But yoga is not like that. Yoga, traditional yoga, is actually taught differently to different people. There are even quotes like Ekastapo Dviradhyayi, the teacher and student learn together, but the student practices alone. So it's a very fascinating concepts like that are existing in the traditional yoga. Another interesting thing is that many modern schools of yoga insist on fanatical life choices for their students that may be sometimes very invasive, and it tries to put everybody into one same box. Whereas traditional yoga is open to empower the students and make their own educated choices. There is no fanaticism in traditional yoga. There is actually an open minded approach that is basically the heart of traditional yoga. Many modern schools of yoga are not suitable for yoga as a therapy, especially because of their close-minded approach to standardized practices or to fanatical approach of only this for this, only this set of practices for them, etc. Whereas traditional yoga offers great flexibility and actually is very well suited for yoga as the therapy, as its values align itself with very fundamental therapeutic principles. Another important thing is modern yoga does not emphasize so much the close interaction between the teacher and student. It's almost like most students are just clients or customers. Whereas traditional yoga does not look at students in this way. It focuses a lot on the sacred bond between the teacher and the student. And this is very essential, and this you will see in most approaches of traditional yoga. And so these are some things that are the differences between the classical yoga as well as the traditional yoga. And we are very proud that Viniyoga is one of the classical schools of yoga that is still around and offers students that possibility. But of course, there are many other wonderful classical schools of yoga as well, in India especially, and which are strongly emphasizing these traditional values, which are very important. Now, why do I say that it's very important? It's because this will impact the future of yoga. When you look at the situation today, yoga is at a very interesting crossroads, and it can go in different directions, two different directions. Now, when you look at the dawn of the 20th century, the yoga industry was literally non-existent. Whereas the teachers who were practicing the yoga, or the yogis who were practicing yoga at that time, they had a very great, amazing depth of knowledge. When you look at people like my grandfather, Swami Kovilyananda, Swami Shivananda, etc., who were there at the beginning of the 20th century, the extent of knowledge was amazing, but the industry of yoga did not exist. You fast forward 100 years today, we are in 2021. It's about 100 years from this time I'm talking. The yoga market is globalized with millions and millions of practitioners. Yet, there remains very little knowledge among the yoga practitioners. Many people are calling themselves yoga teachers, yoga acharyas, etc., with 200 hours or less of training, which is very scary for the field of yoga. It will not augur well for the yoga system, because people will not respect this as an in-depth system if somebody is just an expert after studying it for about 200 hours, which is nothing actually. So there are some challenges that the world of yoga is facing today, and a great reflection is needed, not only from all the practitioners of yoga, but more importantly from those who call themselves the policy makers of yoga, because this will determine which direction the future of yoga will go. So, as I'm going to present to you now a few points for reflection. The first one is that the modern yoga is actually rootless. A tree has to have roots. If the roots are cut out, the tree is going to collapse. The same way, yoga needs to be connected to its roots. The teachings of yoga are normally rooted in the philosophical teachings all the way going back to Patanjali. And if you look at it, my dear friends, if you look at the school of Buddhism, for example, no Buddhist school will be acknowledged as a Buddhist school unless it can trace its ancestry back to the Buddha. The same way, we must insist on yoga schools calling themselves yoga schools, yoga teachers calling themselves yoga teachers, only when they are able to root themselves back to the teachings of Patanjali. If we don't do that, not only we are doing Patanjali a great disservice, but we are actually threatening the future of yoga, because once the roots are cut off, the tree is going to be definitely dead. So please reflect about it, my dear friends, and I invite all of you to start thinking about this and start tracing your origins back and see if it traces back to Maharishi Patanjali one way or another. The second thing that is very fundamental to reflect about now is yoga cannot be understood through modern medicine. Now think about it, my dear friends. When Maharishi Patanjali framed yoga philosophy and practices, or even later day yoga acharyas like Swatmarama in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika or Goraksha in the Goraksha Siddhanta, etc., modern medicine did not even exist. So yoga practices are not based on modern medicine, and nor will modern medicine ever understand yoga practices, because yoga practices are not based on the musculoskeletal system. All the yoga practices were created to influence subtle principles like prana, whereas modern medicine does not even acknowledge what is called prana. Energy is not something that modern medicine talks about, because it cannot be measured. There's no instrument to measure prana. So how can you talk about prana as a medical doctor? It's not possible. So yoga should not be understood through modern medicine. I'm not saying that modern medicine is bad. Modern medicine has its scope of practice, but that scope does not include yoga. Modern medicine should realize that it does not have the monopoly on health. Yoga as a system can also be a system of health. Modern medicine can also be a system of health. Ayurveda can also be a system of health. And we can all function together in a collaborative way, but not step on each other's boundaries or scope of practices. Just like modern medical doctors will not like yoga teachers to prescribe medicines to basically patients, allopathic medicines to patients, we should also request the modern medical doctors to stay out of yoga and focus on their system. This is very important. If yoga is being understood through modern medicine, it will be very inefficient, because it's almost like the blind leading the blind. The third point, which is very important, which I've told many times, is that we must not standardize yoga And we must actually create systems where the quality of standards are raised. The quality standards are raised. And this is a very important thing because not every standardization technique will work for everybody. And then we create problems for the practitioners or the teachers because if they don't fit that protocol, then it creates problems for the practitioner or the teacher. So we need to really be open about this topic and not focus on standardization of yoga, but rather focus on the improvement of the standards of teaching, the standards of practice, etc. The next point for reflection, which I will leave as the last point for reflection, is that yoga is spiritual and not egocentric. And this is very, very important because many people now have started to practice yoga in a very narcissistic manner where they do the yoga positions, take a picture and put it on Instagram and Facebook and things like that to gain more followers, to gain more popularity. And in some ways boost their own ego. And this is really not the approach of yoga. Yoga is a spiritual approach where we become better persons each day through the practice. We are better not only to ourselves, but also the people who we are living with, whether we know them or not. This also includes how we treat animals, how we treat plants, how we treat the whole world. So yoga is a spiritual practice. It's not just an ego-centered practice. And unfortunately, we are at a crossroads where this is also something that has come to play a big role in modern society because most modern yoga is very, very egocentric. This has to change. This has to have some reflection as well. So what is very important, I would say, is that all the institutions that are teaching yoga reflect about these points, and all the policymakers of yoga, like we in the International Yoga Association, for example, we must start thinking about the future of yoga because it can go one way or the other. And if we stand strong in the fundamental principles, in the fundamental philosophies of yoga, yoga will have a bright future. Whereas if we bow down to the commercial interests of yoga and start to make it like a product, and yoga will lose its value, and we will be doing a great disservice to the future generations who would like to be inspired by yoga. So please reflect about it, my friends, and let this be a good place for you to reflect on this auspicious International Day of Yoga. Namaste.